Both women infiltrated the monarchy as outsiders, conveniently securing the adoration of Queen Elizabeth before becoming the absolute linchpins of the British royal family's survival. On April 5th, 2026, the BBC's breaking news ticker stopped the world. And no, it wasn't a joke. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It's not true, really, but it's quite fun watching people's reactions. So, if you're in a crowd, you need to be aware that you're all watching to see what the reaction is. The people in the cars behind have a great time. The Duchess, eternally patronised as the monarchy's predictably unproblematic background character, had abruptly unleashed a spectacular verbal assault that instantly obliterated 10 years of suffocating institutional courtesy. Sophie coolly declared that in all her decades serving the crown, she had never witnessed a performance quite as shockingly improper as that of Meghan Markle. Buckingham Palace, exhibiting an uncharacteristic and lethal speed, immediately deployed a razor-sharp endorsement. The establishment confirmed that the Duchess was merely vocalising the uncompromising behavioural benchmarks necessary to prevent the monarchy from deteriorating into a vulgar spectacle. This calculated manoeuvre was the closest the palace had ever crept towards publicly confirming that the former actress had detonated every conceivable boundary. The lingering interrogation remained. Was this a rogue assassination by a spectacularly exhausted woman, or had the sovereign himself finally authorised the release of the hounds? The glittering facade the British royal family had meticulously guarded for years was finally crumbling. The absolute truth was bleeding out. Before dissecting the spectacular wreckage, one must adequately appreciate the architect of this dismantling. By the moment she graced the BBC's transmission, the Duchess had been ruthlessly navigating the treacherous corridors of royal existence for nearly 35 years. Having wed Prince Edward in the year 2000, she was no fragile debutante. She had elegantly survived the merciless tabloid inquisitions and the labyrinthine, bloodthirsty politics of the globe's most heavily scrutinised dynasty. Emerging not as a casualty, but as an absolute fortress of loyalty, she had secured the profound, unspoken trust of King Charles. Crucially, her lethal legitimacy stems from her own origins as a commoner. She was an interloper who consciously, painfully allowed the ancient institution to mould her, rather than arrogantly attempting to redecorate a 1,000-year-old establishment. Her insights are not regurgitated protocol. They are the glamorous battle scars of a life rigorously endured. Consequently, when the Duchess speaks, the monarchy pays acute attention. And when the palace actively permits her to wield a microphone, it signifies that their diplomatic gag order had finally mutated into a toxic hazard. The genesis of this magnificent public execution traces back to early 2018. Her April 5th testimony was not born of petty malice, but of a chillingly clinical observation. The Duchess dryly recounted issuing a warning to her husband almost the exact second the American import parachuted onto the manicured lawns. Sophie astutely diagnosed that the newcomer was exerting a frankly exhausting amount of energy, not to seamlessly assimilate, but to execute a hostile corporate takeover. The Duchess sardonically observed that the former actress possessed zero interest in the modest script she was handed, focusing her ravenous gaze entirely on the significantly grander throne situated conveniently nearby. Yes, the throne, explicitly reserved for the heir. This was not a case of innocent, wide-eyed transatlantic naivety. It was a military-grade social climbing expedition mounted by a woman who treated a millennium of sacred duty as nothing more than an audition for a starring role. Meghan Markle did not infiltrate the British monarchy merely to collect the title of Duchess of Sussex. According to the brilliantly unsympathetic assessment, Sussex was perceived as nothing more than an insulting participation trophy. It was merely the waiting room. The ultimate objective was to forcefully embed herself into the gravitational pull of the future king. She demanded absolute narrative supremacy, fundamentally repulsed by the concept of playing a glamorous extra. To execute this delusion, she would have to unilaterally demolish the sacred hierarchy of the Wales household from within. The public, utterly hypnotised by the media's manufactured fairy tale, entirely missed the bloodless coup occurring in the drawing rooms. Behind the gilded gates, there was absolutely no harmonious quartet. There was only a rigid chain of command built on centuries of bloodshed and protocol, alongside one spectacularly arrogant woman who decided those rules were terribly inconvenient for her brand. One must marvel at the breathtaking hubris required to saunter into an empire that has outlasted world wars, and genuinely believe it could be bent to a personal aesthetic within a mere 20 months. That catastrophic overestimation of self-importance perfectly encapsulates the ensuing tragedy. Sophie expertly diagnosed this arrival as a contagion of cheap Hollywood theatricality. It did not merely clash with royal decorum, it aggressively attempted to cannibalize it. In the shallow digital pools of Los Angeles, relevance is aggressively purchased with manufactured outrage and maximum volume. Conversely, within the venerable House of Windsor, true supremacy is exclusively achieved through the elegant, silent erasure of one's own ego to guarantee the crown's survival. Generations of commoners had absorbed this brutal truth, forging extraordinary legacies of service. Sophie had mastered this silent sacrifice, as had Catherine. Yet, the American Duchess obstinately refused to pay the entry fee. The Duchess observed that rather than learning the quiet grace of her new reality, the interloper violently demanded that the monarchy morph into a chaotic reflection of her own desires. This spectacular refusal to bow to the crown would eventually bankrupt her of every scrap of credibility. The narrative inevitably steers towards the most deeply uncomfortable obsession, the targeted fixation on William. It is one matter to possess a feral ambition. It is quite another to lock that ambition onto a specific, married sovereign in waiting. According to this ruthless post-mortem, the target was always the future king. It is vital to clarify that Sophie masterfully avoided any crude soap opera allegations of a romantic scandal. Instead, she illuminated a far more unsettling psychological warfare, a meticulously choreographed strategy of manufactured proximity, desperately designed to visually tether the interloper to the air. It was a suffocating, deliberate campaign to infiltrate his personal orbit, aggressively erasing every boundary the institution had painstakingly erected. This tactical assault apparently commenced the very second she crossed the threshold. Sophie clinically revealed that as early as the Sandringham Christmas of 2018, long before the spectacle of the royal wedding, terrified palace personnel were already frantically cataloguing anomalies in her physical conduct toward William. While the gullible public was entirely mesmerised by this curated performance of transatlantic affection, the security and protocol teams were silently observing a high-stakes security breach unfold in real time. She emerged as an individual pathologically incapable of respecting the invisible yet ironclad geographical boundaries that govern the establishment. The Duchess did not merely recount trivial faux pas. She exposed a relentless tactical assault, beginning with the infamous June 2018 garden party. A mere 80 hours after securing her royal marriage certificate, the newly minted Duchess allegedly ambushed William. Dispensing entirely with customary deference, she inflicted a nauseatingly protracted cheek kiss, coupled with a vice-like proprietary clamp on his forearm, a ghastly spectacle that caused the future sovereign to visibly rigor mortis in broad daylight. The courtiers were absolutely petrified. This was emphatically not a nervous bride clumsily navigating aristocratic icebreakers. It was a predator who had worn a tiara for barely 4 days and was already systematically dismantling the personal airspace of the monarch in waiting. The geographical warfare escalated at a November 2018 mental health summit within Buckingham Palace. Lenses immortalised the horrifying moment she plastered a flat, commanding palm directly against William's spine. It was a suffocating gesture of absolute ownership, a patronising stroke typically deployed only by a spouse or a heavily exasperated mother. The prince executed an immediate, frosty evasion manoeuvre. Sophie clinically branded this desperate dodge as a silent, yet screaming, rejection of a deeply inappropriate physical trespass. The spectacle reached a farcical crescendo at the 2020 polo match. Lurking away from the public gaze, the American import allegedly executed a series of aggressive spatial manoeuvres, physically wedging herself into William's immediate vicinity. Bypassing her own husband entirely, she launched a barrage of unsolicited conversation at the heir. She deployed what Sophie devastatingly termed a theatrical pantomime of intimacy. This performance was ruthlessly calculated to broadcast a completely fictional, highly exclusive bond. It was never merely a clumsy embrace, Sophie scoffed with patrician disdain. It was a hostile transmission of fabricated affection, desperate to televise a profound connection that the recipient actively abhorred. The truly macabre revelation lies in the absolute premeditation of it all. The Duchess of Edinburgh entirely dismissed the pathetic, clueless American informality alibi that highly paid publicists had peddled to the masses. She identified these suffocating touches as a weaponized strategy, a relentless siege to fracture the Wales household by forcefully superimposing herself onto the future monarch's visual narrative. The interloper, it appeared, was utterly indifferent to her own husband's validation, starving exclusively for the heir's gaze. The Sussex coronet was seemingly inadequate. She allegedly craved the starring role of the captivating, disruptive enchantress within the Wales saga, determined to shatter William's legendary stoicism. The sheer audacity of the delusion is staggering. For those clinging to the desperate fantasy that the palace is merely exaggerating, one must examine the catastrophic February 2019 Royal Foundation Forum. The audience was fed a nauseatingly sweet illusion of the Fab Four, seamlessly uniting for philanthropy. Backstage, however, a vicious insurgency was unfolding. The Duchess recounted that the newest recruit staged an absolute mutiny over the meticulously plotted seating chart, completely shredding an itinerary that had been cemented weeks prior. She obnoxiously demanded to be planted right beside William, utterly refusing to sit with her spouse like a conventional partner. Once on stage, she reportedly bulldozed through the agreed talking points, aggressively talking over Catherine to guarantee her own echo dominated the ensuing media cycle. The resulting atmospheric toxicity was so radioactive that it left the Princess of Wales quietly sobbing backstage. This was not a minor creative clash over a microphone. It was, as Sophie clinically diagnosed, a full-scale declaration of war against the monarchy's fundamental hierarchy. The former actress harboured the tragic delusion that her fleeting Hollywood notoriety entitled her to co-rule alongside the future sovereign. She remained violently allergic to the fact that within this ancient bloodline, supreme authority is earned through birthright and grueling servitude, not by a pathetic accumulation of Instagram followers. This brings the dissection to the infamous, heavily classified internal dossiers. Shattering an unprecedented vault of secrecy, a senior royal finally confirmed the existence of the explosive April 2021 HR tribunal. While the global press lazily fixated on the superficial bullying allegations, a scandal conveniently smothered by the tear-stained Oprah broadcast. The truth was infinitely darker. The Duchess revealed that this administrative file was not merely a collection of staff grievances. It was a terrifyingly exhaustive dossier chronicling years of sociopathic etiquette obliterations, aggressive boundary trespasses, and a persistent refusal to exhibit basic decency. This magnificent ledger recorded the interloper relentlessly bombarding senior royals with wildly inappropriate, late-night text messages, aggressively circumventing established protocols to strong-arm her own agenda. Worse still, it catalogued her chronic inability to respect the physical sanctity of the late Queen and Prince Charles. She subjected the bewildered monarchs to suffocating, highly theatrical embraces, manufacturing a horrific intimacy that left the entire room utterly repulsed. Most treasonously, the dossier exposed her lucrative side hustle of leaking sacred familial dialogues to voracious American media mercenaries. She meticulously fed a highly marketable, fictional narrative, portraying a radiant, vulnerable outsider slowly being strangled by a pack of frigid, archaic British vampires. She never harboured a solitary intention of blending into the tapestry. She aggressively sought the title of disruptor-in-chief, salivating over the spotlight with the desperation of a fading starlet, Sophie observed. If the crown could not be physically wrenched onto her own head, she was absolutely committed to ensuring the reigning monarch's daily existence was a living, breathing hell. That specific, lethal observation was perhaps the most illuminating bomb detonated during the April 5th broadcast. It entirely annihilates the pathetic fairy tales surrounding the Sussex exit that the global media so desperately peddled. This was absolutely not a tragic exile of two lovers hunted by institutional cruelty and bigotry. It was rather a calculated, bitter corporate retreat executed by a narcissist who finally grasped that her hostile takeover of the British throne had failed spectacularly. William proved to be an utterly impenetrable fortress, and the 1,000-year-old firm flatly refused to kneel. Consequently, her final venomous pivot was to douse the entire estate in petrol as she scrambled for the exit. The Oprah Winfrey spectacle was never a traumatic cry for salvation. The Duchess confirmed it was a ruthlessly polished commercial product launch. That sofa performance was the ultimate assassination of protocol, Sophie noted with icy precision. It was a highly lucrative, meticulously rehearsed ambush masquerading as vulnerability. The aristocratic veteran admitted she had repeatedly extended the olive branch, offering the priceless mentorship of a commoner who had actually survived the royal meat grinder. Having navigated those suffocating, unbending protocols herself, she understood the terrifying pressure cooker the newcomer was stumbling blindly into. She attempted to impart that grueling wisdom, only to have the lifeline arrogantly swatted away on every single occasion. The American's rejection, dripping in hubris, was terrifyingly stark. "I have completely secured the spare prince," the interloper reportedly sneered. "He is the absolute entirety of my leverage, and I require absolutely nothing else." The Duchess of Edinburgh's dissection of that chillingly arrogant declaration was utterly devastating. The former actress possessed absolutely zero interest in acquiring a royal mentor. She demanded an absolute, terrifying monopoly over her husband's fragile psyche. She systematically engineered his total quarantine, severing his lifelines to the institution to ensure he became entirely reliant on her curated hallucinations. This calculated isolation guaranteed that when the lucrative moment finally arrived to monetize his deep-seated trauma for an insatiable global audience, there would not be a single rational voice remaining to pull him back from the precipice. The systematic solitary confinement of the spare prince was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. For anyone bewildered as to how a royal, nurtured within one of the most fiercely protective fraternal bonds in modern aristocratic history, deteriorated into a bitter, estranged exile. This broadcast provided the grotesque autopsy. Sophie's testimony offered a flawlessly brutal illumination of a deeply uncomfortable reality. Throughout the dark corridors of 2019 and early 2020, a lethally methodical amputation of the prince's ancestral ties was executed. His previously open diplomatic channels to William's household were abruptly and aggressively cemented shut. Frantic requests for simple, fraternal reunions were consistently swatted away with a repetitive, aggressively passive-aggressive script. The Duchess insists our schedule is suffocating. The Duchess dictates that we require an indefinite exclusion zone, Sophie mocked, summarising the pathetic excuses. She diagnosed this operation not as a sudden need for privacy, but as a tyrannical psychological blockade. The interloper brilliantly rebranded herself as the sole messianic saviour capable of comprehending his damaged soul, while simultaneously framing the very family that had fiercely protected him for 35 years as bloodthirsty antagonists. She desperately needed to infect him with a paranoia that the entire globe was conspiring against their magnificent love story, leaving him with no conceivable option but to blindly follow her disastrous march into exile. The Duchess then navigated the prince's well-documented psychological frailties with a surprisingly aristocratic grace, indicating a lingering, tragic pity for the fallen royal. She acknowledged the horrific void left by his mother's demise, the chronic childhood trauma, and the crushing, existential redundancy of being the secondary royal in a bloodline that functionally only requires the heir. These were profound, undeniable psychological lacerations. Yet, the testimony chillingly revealed that instead of facilitating any genuine healing, his wife gleefully weaponized these vulnerabilities as instruments of supreme leverage. She relentlessly agitated his grievances and sharpened his profound estrangement, ensuring that his childhood sanctuary was permanently perceived as a lethal threat rather than a protective fortress. This is the horrifying crux of the catastrophe that refuses to be safely ignored. It transcends the vulgarity of stolen titles or tacky streaming contracts. It is the grotesque human tragedy of a vulnerable man being systematically brainwashed to despise the very people who had anchored his entire existence. The August 2019 christening of their firstborn served as a magnificent, egotistical flex of dominance. This was emphatically not a fiercely protective mother shielding her infant. It was a hostile, calculated assertion of absolute control. The new Duchess obnoxiously vetoed the establishment's photographers, aggressively concealed the identities of the godparents, and draped the entire sacred ceremony in a cloak of absurd secrecy, blatantly violating the transparency laws that had legitimized royal progeny for centuries. This theatrical circus was never about protecting a child, Sophie declared with withering certainty. It was an arrogant distress flare, fired directly at the monarch, violently insisting that the sovereign's jurisdiction evaporated the moment it reached the Sussexes' welcome mat. Consequently, when the ancient institution, rigidly bound by centuries of unyielding constitutional law, politely declined to finance their rogue Hollywood court or grant them parity with the actual future king and queen, the highly lucrative mythology of extreme victimhood was spectacularly born. Every logical administrative refusal was instantly twisted into horrific evidence of systemic bigotry. Every standard royal protocol was hysterically rebranded as an oppressive instrument of torture. Every perfectly reasonable administrative boundary was instantly weaponized as irrefutable proof of the establishment's supposed barbarism. The Duchess observed with a magnificently exhausted sigh that the interloper had successfully hallucinated a banal domestic squabble into a full-blown international human rights atrocity. The ensuing constitutional migraine inevitably centred around the royal offspring, their fiercely contested titles, and the suffocating cloud of public suspicion that simply refused to evaporate. By 2026, the transatlantic soap opera had mutated into a grotesque legal labyrinth, a minefield that Sophie's explosive April 5th transmission navigated with breathtaking ruthlessness. The aristocratic legitimacy of Archie and Lilibet had triggered ferocious, closed-door diplomatic warfare ever since the passing of Queen Elizabeth II in autumn 2022. The exiled duo unilaterally plastered the Prince and Princess prefixes across their commercial branding in mid-2023. However, the Duchess gleefully shattered the illusion of a smooth succession, revealing that the palace's endorsement was entirely conditional and their icy hesitation was utterly divorced from any vulgar matters of genetic heritage. These titles are the absolute embodiment of ancestral trust and total institutional transparency, Sophie clarified with devastating precision. One cannot actively spend 6 years attempting to torch the monarchy to the ground, only to shamelessly demand that very same institution supply premium branding accessories for one's toddlers. She then casually dropped a constitutional hand grenade that undoubtedly sent transatlantic legal teams scrambling for their defibrillators. Confronted with the murky, relentless tabloid hysteria surrounding the children's birth documentation, the Duchess spectacularly refused to issue the customary diplomatic denial. She curated her vocabulary with the lethal exactitude of a sniper. The sovereign never once stooped to demanding a biological swab, she enunciated carefully. However, when the populace and the palace question why the royal proclamations were stalled, the sole answer is absolute administrative discretion. Within this dynasty, we must guarantee not merely the biology of the heir, but the pure, uncorrupted intention behind their presentation. By tethering the former actress's pathological obsession with clinical secrecy directly to the Crown's reluctance, Sophie masterfully dumped the entire toxic cloud of public suspicion squarely onto the mother's own arrogant lap. The extreme privacy, so aggressively marketed as a divine maternal right, was brutally exposed as a catastrophic constitutional failure. Then, naturally, the dissection pivoted to Harry. His petulant, endless courtroom tantrums against the Home Office over state-funded bodyguards, a bizarre demand to privately rent public servants, summoned the Duchess's most acidic contempt. To aggressively demand the lethal protection of the state, whilst gleefully spitting on the grueling duties that finance. It is not merely oblivious, it is actively perilous, she declared. He throws tantrums for the impenetrable shield of the monarchy, yet runs screaming from the heavy sword of its obligations. The unspoken parallel to the disgraced Prince Andrew hung in the air, a deliberate and violently pointed comparison. If one refuses to bleed for the firm, one is entirely stripped of the state's armour. There are zero loopholes for those who hallucinate. They are uniquely special exceptions to a 1,000-year-old rule. King Charles had reportedly transformed his paternal leniency into absolute granite by early 2025, especially after classified metrics revealed the American Duchess's approval rating had spectacularly nosedived to a humiliating 20%. The sovereign's classified edict was chillingly unambiguous. There would be absolutely no sequel to the Sandringham summit. The fantastical dream of a half-in, half-out royal comeback was permanently incinerated. The gates of the palace were not merely locked, they had been permanently bricked over, Sophie concluded with grim finality. This inevitably elevates Catherine, the magnificent anchor who utterly refused to drift. Any autopsy of the spectacular transatlantic downfall is pathetically incomplete without studying the woman who remained completely, infuriatingly unbothered. Sophie's glowing homage to Catherine, Princess of Wales, functioned as the impenetrable moral spine of her devastating April 5th broadcast. If the interloper was a screaming, destructive hurricane, the Princess of Wales was an absolute, terrifying glacier. The true comedic genius of this disparity is that it was never genuinely a competition to begin with. This was primarily because Catherine remained magnificently oblivious to the imaginary rivalry. She never stooped to a tacky scrambling for the best lighting. She never threw pathetic tantrums over equal marquee billing. She emphatically never demanded that an ancient empire accelerate its majestic crawl to accommodate her personal ego. She merely clamped on her tiara, ignored the noise, and executed the grueling labour. While the California export was desperately haggling over soulless streaming contracts and micromanaging her paparazzi angles, the future queen was crouched on linoleum floors with toddlers, meticulously constructing a generational framework on early childhood development that will fundamentally alter British society. Catherine grasped the fundamental reality that serving the crown is a brutal marathon, never a cheap Hollywood sprint, Sophie noted, her aristocratic frost miraculously thawing when mentioning the princess. She intrinsically understood that the dazzling illumination never emanates from the individual. It merely reflects off the weight of the institution. The statistical bloodbath Sophie unveiled for January 2026 was nothing short of a comedic masterpiece. Catherine commanded a supreme, untouchable 75% approval rating. William trailed a whisper behind at an ironclad 70%. Meanwhile, the Grand Disruptor was languishing in the gutter with a catastrophic 20%. 3 inhabitants of the exact same dynasty, surviving the identical epoch, wrestling with the same suffocating machinery. 3 staggeringly, hilariously divergent destinies. The brutal mathematics simply refuse to lie. The ultimate humiliation manifested during the Together at Christmas broadcast, a serene event that the desperate Californian PR machine aggressively attempted to sabotage by launching a tacky Netflix special in the exact same hour. Catherine effortlessly magnetized a staggering 10 million viewers. The Sussex Vanity Project failed so spectacularly it couldn't even claw its way into the UK's top 20. It was the exact same exhausting playbook of sabotage they have lazily deployed for years, the Duchess mocked. First, unleashing the Oprah circus while Prince Philip was fighting for his life. Then, dropping a dramatic trailer to eclipse the Earthshot prize. And ultimately, attempting a pathetic ratings war against a literal charity carol service. It exposes a cavernous, fundamental absence of basic human decency. One cannot parasitically bottle the prestige of the crown to peddle lifestyle merchandise, while simultaneously attempting to assassinate the very individuals doing the grueling labour. The British populace, armed with an exquisite radar for utter nonsense, effortlessly distinguished the gold from the cheap plastic. The Princess of Wales's grinding dedication to policy reforms and mental health crusades was entirely devoid of theatrical posturing. It required absolutely zero bloated streaming deals or orchestrated paparazzi ambushes to validate its existence. It simply, undeniably mattered. The citizenry, possessing a cynical lie detector forged over centuries of scrutinising aristocratic scandals, recognised true statesmanship instantly. They overwhelmingly elected the woman who silently wipes her own tears behind locked doors so she can serve in the sunlight. Sophie noted with lethal quietness over the actress who squeezes out a tear precisely when the streaming cameras demand it. The final, merciless verdict of history was approaching. As the explosive April 5th transmission marched toward its magnificent finale, the Duchess pivoted her gaze toward the horizon. She sketched the portrait of a sovereign establishment that had crawled out of the chaotic transatlantic hurricane, vastly leaner, infinitely sharper, and aggressively unapologetic. The suffocating melodramas, the pathetic scramble for titles, the televised couch confessions, the corporate whining, and the endless courtroom hysterics had undoubtedly inflicted deep lacerations. However, in Sophie's flawlessly ruthless autopsy, this circus had functioned as a glorious, brutal purgative. The hysteria had successfully incinerated the frivolous deadwood, violently coercing the ancient firm to aggressively recommit to its grim, unyielding duty. Our tedious era of administrative correction has mercifully concluded, Sophie declared, with the chilling firmness of an executioner. We are excruciatingly aware of our exact identity. We are the unyielding stewards of the British populace's blood, soaked history. We are emphatically not employed to harvest cheap validation on trivial social media platforms. We exist solely to be the impregnable fortress of trust when actual catastrophic crises detonate. By January 2026, the entire catastrophic Sussex facade had violently slammed into an impenetrable brick wall. Corporate giants like Spotify and Netflix were reportedly slashing their bloated contracts in sheer panic. Simultaneously, their beloved Archwell Foundation suffered a humiliating 50% drop in charitable alms. The parasitic commercial operation, explicitly constructed upon the smouldering wreckage of the House of Windsor, ironically starved to death without its primary host. It desperately required the one pristine asset it had so arrogantly discarded, the unassailable credibility of the crown. One simply cannot peddle glittering royal adjacency to a gullible American demographic while simultaneously shrieking that the very same aristocratic family is a frigid, racist, and utterly dysfunctional nightmare. That spectacular level of cognitive dissonance inevitably implodes under the crushing weight of its own staggering absurdity. One absolutely cannot publicly amputate oneself from a toxic bloodline and then shamelessly attempt to merchandise a lifestyle brand entirely dependent on their regal glow. The global audience possesses functioning eyes, and they easily identify naked hypocrisy the Duchess observed with lethal amusement. The Duchess subsequently dissected the palace's infuriating strategy of absolute silence amidst the relentless bombardment of literary whining, tacky streaming documentaries and grotesque trademark scrambles. She dismantled the public's pathetic misconception that this quietude equated to weakness. It was, in fact, the terrifying silence of sovereign finality. The King and Prince William had executed a ruthlessly calculated military manoeuvre. They recognised that descending into the mud to engage with a pathologically performative adversary merely provides the toxic oxygen the parasite desperately craves. Therefore, they executed the ultimate insult by simply evaporating them from the agenda, by relentlessly focusing on authentic triumphs like the Together at Christmas broadcast and the grueling state obligations of January 2026, a terrifyingly lean and focused monarchy emerged. Spearheaded by William and Catherine's flawless execution, the palace effectively suffocated the Sussex hysteria without ever needing to officially declare war. Consequently, the Duchess of Edinburgh delivered her absolute, lethal verdict on the interloper who had aggressively commandeered the spotlight for an excruciating 8-year royal crisis. It was arguably the most globally catastrophic aristocratic meltdown since the disgraceful abdication of Edward VIII. She shamelessly treated this 1,000-year-old dynasty like a cheap theatrical stage. Sophie's aristocratic timbre lingered, dripping with absolute contempt. We naively treated her as cherished kin, right up until the exact microsecond she gleefully proved she was a venomous impostor. This execution was not delivered with unhinged shouting or petty bitterness. It was merely final, bearing the terrifying weight that only the absolute truth possesses. This feral element, as Sophie had so astutely diagnosed from the very inception of the disaster, harboured a sociopathic refusal to be tamed by the sacred requirements of service. Yet, this magnificent tantrum had fundamentally failed to shatter the ancient institution. It had merely subjected the firm to an extreme stress test, violently exposing the microscopic cracks and quiet tensions that had festered within the palace architecture for decades. Ultimately, when the chaotic dust settled and the parasitic streaming cameras packed away their lighting rigs, the hysterical sofa confessions faded into the embarrassing archives of pop culture. What miraculously remained standing was exactly what had weathered centuries of plague and war: the crown, the unrelenting duty, and the stoic individuals who willingly chose to shoulder the burden. The iron gates have been permanently welded shut. The kingdom stubbornly, magnificently endures, and the ruthless judge of history, possessing an exceptionally brutal memory for arrogant interlopers who mistake an empire's stage for their own personal dressing room, will effortlessly handle the rest. The global audience, after a decade of suffocating manipulation, finally comprehends the absolute carnage that unfolded behind those gilded doors. The broadcast concluded with a stark demand for the mesmerised viewership to engage with the unfolding historical drama. The commentator challenged anyone who recognised that the British monarchy had just narrowly survived its most venomous internal assassination attempt to vocalise their verdict immediately. For those cynical enough to suspect that the Sussex reckoning is merely pausing to reload its artillery, the narrator demanded their theories be broadcasted as well. This toxic, glamorous warfare is emphatically not concluded, and the terrifying questions continue to multiply. The audience was urgently instructed to pledge their digital allegiance to ensure they witnessed every incoming casualty of this aristocratic bloodbath. The channel demanded validation from anyone whose perception of this grotesque royal chapter was permanently altered by Sophie's magnificent assassination. The narrator insisted this brutal autopsy be aggressively distributed, decreeing that anyone subjected to the Sussex fairy tale absolutely deserved to witness its glorious, bloody demolition. The transmission finally cut to black, promising an inevitable return for the next act of the royal apocalypse.